Welcome to Bedtime Stories. Subscribe and let the story lead you to where time loses its boundaries. We begin. The complete history of the Vatican. Rome, the year 64 AD. A July night. Hot and stifling. The city is plunged into darkness, illuminated only by an ominous red light. Fire has been devouring Rome for 6 days already. The blaze started in the merchant shops at the foot of the Palatine Hill, among warehouses of oil, wood, and fabrics. The wind caught the sparks and carried them further. The narrow streets of the ancient city became corridors of death, through which the firestorm raced. Out of the 14 districts of Rome, 10 are completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are left with no property. The bodies of those who did not manage to flee lie charred among the ruins. The smell of soot, burnt meat, and melted lead hangs over the city. People in panic blame the Emperor Nero. Rumors circulate that he himself ordered the city to be set on fire to make room for a new palace, that he stood on a tower and played the lyre, watching Rome burn, singing of the fall of Troy. Nero understands that the people are ready to revolt. He needs a scapegoat, someone on whom the blame can be pinned. His advisors suggest the Christians. This is a small sect, followers of a preacher named Jesus executed in Judea. There are only a few thousand of them in a vast city of 1 million, but the Romans hate them. Christians refuse to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods, do not recognize the divinity of the emperor, and call pagan temples the dwellings of demons. They meet secretly at night, in catacombs, in cemeteries. Wild rumors circulate about them, that they drink the blood of infants, commit incest, and worship a donkey. Nero issues a decree. Christians are accused of the burning of Rome. Arrests begin. Soldiers burst into homes, seizing everyone known as a Christian or simply suspected of being one. They are thrown into prisons, the Mamertine, the most ominous prison in Rome, where prisoners languish in underground cells without light, where rats devour the living and the dead. Then the executions begin. Romans know how to turn death into a spectacle. In Nero's gardens on the Vatican Hill, nightly games are organized. Christians, smeared with pitch, are tied to poles and set on fire. They burn like living torches, illuminating the gardens while the emperor and his guests feast, watching the agony of the victims. Some are sewn into animal skins and thrown to dogs to be torn apart. Others are crucified along the Appian Way, the main artery leading south from Rome. Their bodies are left to rot on the crosses as a warning. In the arena of Nero's circus, on the Vatican Hill, mass executions are staged. Thousands of Romans gather to watch Christians being thrown to lions, bears, and bulls. The beasts, hungry and enraged, tear the victims to pieces. The crowd roars, applauds, and demands more blood. This entertainment is a way to distract the people from disaster spread and circuses. As the poet Juvenal would later say, among those arrested is an old man named Simon, but everyone calls him Peter. He's about 65 years old, a great age for a century when the average life expectancy was 30 years. Peter is a fisherman from Galilee, from the shores of the lake of Gennesaret. His hands are rough, calloused, accustomed to nets and oars. His face is weathered, covered with wrinkles from long years under the sun. He speaks Greek with a strong Galilean accent, which the Romans consider crude and provincial. But this simple fisherman is one of the closest disciples of Jesus, the man whom Christ called the rock upon which the church would be built. Peter was with Jesus from the very beginning, saw the miracles, heard the sermons, was a witness to the transfiguration on Mount Tabor. He also thrice denied Christ on the night of the arrest, fearing for his life. This betrayal tormented him for the rest of his life. After the resurrection, Jesus appeared to Peter, forgave him, thrice asked if he loved him, and thrice Peter confirmed his love. "Feed my sheep," Christ said, giving Peter the mission to lead his followers. After the ascension of Jesus, it was Peter who became the leader of the apostles, the first preacher, converting 3,000 people in one day at Pentecost. Peter preached in Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. He was arrested, thrown into prisons, beaten, Once, an angel miraculously freed him from the prison of King Herod. He traveled to Antioch, where for the first time the followers of Jesus were called Christians. Then, several years ago, he arrived in Rome, the heart of the empire, where he founded a Christian community. The Roman community was small, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people, mostly the poor, slaves, and freedmen. Though there were wealthy patrons, they met in houses, in catacombs, underground cemeteries where they buried the dead. There they performed the Eucharist, broke bread, drank wine in memory of Jesus, sang songs, read scripture, and baptized new converts. Peter was their bishop, their pastor. He preached, taught, and performed miracles of healing. People said that even his shadow, falling on the sick, healed them. He wrote epistles to other Christian communities, exhorting them to hold to the faith under conditions of persecution. His authority was enormous not only in Rome, but throughout the Christian world. When the arrests began after the fire, the Christians of Rome begged Peter to flee. "You are too important for the church," they said. "Your death will be a huge loss. You must survive to continue preaching." Peter did not want to leave the flock. He remembered his betrayal 30 years ago, when he grew afraid and denied Christ. He did not want to flee again, but in the end, he agreed. Late at night, he left Rome via the Appian Way, heading south. The moon illuminated the ancient paved road built 400 years ago. On both sides stood the tombs of wealthy Romans, marble mausoleums, statues, and monuments. The dead gazed upon the old apostle leaving the city. Suddenly, a few kilometers from the city gates, Peter saw a vision. Coming toward him was a man shining with divine light. Peter instantly recognized him. Jesus, his teacher, his Lord. Overwhelmed, Peter fell to his knees. "Quo vadis, Domini?" he asked in Latin, the language he had learned over the years in Rome. "Where are you going, Lord?" "I am going to Rome to be crucified again," Christ answered. The words pierced Peter like a sword. He understood their meaning instantly. If he flees, Christ will be crucified again in his followers, left without a pastor. His duty is to return, accept martyrdom, and die for the faith as his teacher died. The vision vanished. Peter stood up, turned around, and went back to Rome. He knew he was going to his death, but there was peace in his heart. He would not betray Christ again. On the spot where the meeting took place, a small church, Domini Quo Vadis, would later be built, which stands there to this day, 2,000 years later. Peter returned to Rome, and was immediately arrested. Someone betrayed him, perhaps for a reward. Romans paid for information about Christians. He was thrown into the Mamertine prison, into an underground cell where the church of San Pietro in Vincoli would later be built. There he spent several months, perhaps baptizing his jailers, as legend has it, using water that miraculously broke through from the rock. Then came the day of execution. Peter was sentenced to crucifixion, the same execution that Jesus endured. But Peter, considering himself unworthy to die in the same way as his teacher, asked to be crucified upside down. The Roman executioners agreed. Moreover, such a position made the agony even more painful, prolonging the suffering, which was the goal of the execution, not just to kill, but to make one suffer publicly as an example to others. The execution took place in the arena of Nero's circus, built on the Vatican Hill on the west bank of the Tiber. This place was outside the sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium, because Roman law forbade executions and burials within the Pomerium. The Vatican Hill was considered an unclean pagan place. 4 centuries here, Etruscan priests, the predecessors of the Romans, uttered their vaticinations, prophecies, by observing the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrificial animals. From this word, vaticination, the name Vatican possibly originated. In the center of the circus stood a huge obelisk of red granite brought from Egypt by Emperor Caligula. This obelisk, 25 meters high, was created in the 10th century BC for the Temple of the Sun in Heliopolis. Hieroglyphs glorifying the pharaoh are carved on its faces. Caligula installed it here, as an ornament for his circus. This obelisk is the only structure of Nero's circus that has survived to our days. Now it stands in St. Peter's Square, 200 meters from its original location, a silent witness to the apostles' execution. Peter was brought to the arena. A crowd of Romans filled the stands, several thousand spectators who had come to watch another execution of Christians. For them, it was entertainment, no more significant than gladiatorial bouts or chariot races. They ate, drank, chatted, and placed bets. How many Christians will be killed today? The executioners stripped Peter, laid him on the ground, turned him upside down, and then began to drive the nails. First the feet, piercing the bones, fixing them to the vertical beam of the cross. Then the arms, stretched along the horizontal beam. The nails were thick, square in cross-section, forged from iron. They pierced the flesh and crushed the bones, causing inhuman pain. Then the cross was raised and set into a socket in the ground. Peter hung upside down. The entire weight of his body pulled on his hands and feet, tearing the wounds. Blood flowed down his arms and dripped from his head to the ground. Breathing became difficult. In the inverted position, blood rushed to the head. The heart beat frantically, the lungs compressed. Crucifixion was one of the cruelest forms of execution invented by humanity. Death came slowly, from suffocation, when the muscles weakened and the person could no longer raise the chest to inhale. Usually, it took from a few hours to several days. In the inverted position, death could come faster, but it was still hours of unbearable agony. Christians, risking their lives, watched from afar, hidden among the crowd or behind columns. They prayed, wept, and sang psalms quietly, so as not to be heard. They saw their pastor dying but could not help. Legends say that Peter preached even from the cross, addressing the crowd, calling for repentance, and forgiving his tormentors. But, most likely, he was in no condition to speak. His whole body screamed in pain. Every breath was a torment. After a few hours, it was all over. Peter died. Roman soldiers checked if he was indeed dead by piercing him with a spear. Blood and water flowed from the wound, a sign of death. The body was left on the cross for a few more hours as a lesson to others. When it grew dark and the crowd dispersed, Christians approached secretly. They bribed the soldiers or simply took advantage of the fact that the guard had weakened. They took Peter's body down from the cross, wrapped it in linens, as was customary among the Jews, and carried it away. Nearby on the slope of the Vatican Hill was a necropolis, a city of the dead. Here were buried those who had no right to burial in prestigious places: the poor, foreigners, slaves. Among the simple graves were also the wealthy mausoleums of Roman families. The Christians buried Peter here, in a simple grave dug in the ground. The spot was marked with a simple stone, with the Greek letter P scratched on it, the first letter of the name Petros. Number inscriptions, no decorations. The modest grave of a simple fisherman who died for his faith. No one then could have imagined that this blood, spilled on the Vatican Hill, would become the foundation of the greatest religious and political empire that in 2,000 years, the smallest but one of the most influential states in the world would stand here. Thus ended the earthly life of Simon Peter, fisherman, apostle, first bishop of Rome, the first pope. Though this title would appear centuries later, but his story was only beginning. His grave would become a sacred place, a center of pilgrimage, the heart of the Christian world. Upon it, the greatest cathedrals would be built. Around it, a city, a state, an empire of faith would grow. In the shadow of death, after the execution of Peter, the Roman Christian community was left without a leader, but not without hope. The Apostle Paul, another great preacher, was also in Rome. He had arrived here as a prisoner, brought from Judea for trial before the emperor, a right he held as a Roman citizen. Paul spent 2 years under house arrest in Rome, preaching, teaching, and receiving visitors. Paul was the complete opposite of Peter. Peter, a simple fisherman, uneducated, speaking with an accent. Paul, a Pharisee educated by the great Rabbi Gamaliel, a scholar of the Torah, speaking several languages, a Roman citizen. Peter had been with Jesus from the very beginning. He saw him, heard him, touched him. Paul never met Jesus during his lifetime. He was converted through a vision on the road to Damascus while he was a persecutor of Christians. There were disagreements between them. At the Council of Jerusalem, they argued about whether Gentiles who accepted Christianity had to follow Jewish law, undergo circumcision, and observe kashrut. Peter hesitated. Paul insisted that the law was no longer mandatory, that salvation comes through faith in Christ, not through the works of the law. His position prevailed, and Christianity separated from Judaism, becoming a universal religion. Now, after Peter's death, Paul became the main authority of the Roman community, but his time was also coming to an end. In 67 or 68 AD, Paul was executed. As a Roman citizen, he could not be crucified. That was too humiliating for citizens. He was executed by the sword, beheaded on the road to Ostia outside of Rome, at a place now called Tre Fontane, 3 fountains. Legend has it that his head, upon falling to the ground, bounced 3 times, and at each spot, a spring gushed forth. Paul's body was buried on that same road in the catacombs. Over his grave, the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls would later be built, one of the 4 main basilicas of Rome. But that would be centuries later. The Roman community was left without its great apostles, but the faith did not die. A new bishop was elected, a successor to Peter. This was Linus, mentioned by Paul in his epistles. Linus ruled the community for 12 years, then was seized and executed. After him, Anacletus became the bishop, also a martyr. Then Clement, author of the Epistle to the Corinthians, the third after Peter, also executed. According to legend, he was thrown into the sea with an anchor around his neck. So the relay of the bishops of Rome went on. Each knew they were accepting a position that would most likely end in a martyr's death. Of the first 30 bishops of Rome, 29 were executed or died a violent death. Only Victor I died a natural death at the end of the 2nd century. The persecutions of Christians were not constant. There were periods of relative calm when the authorities ignored the Christians, but periodically new waves of persecution flared up. Under Emperor Domitian in the 90s of the 1st century, under Trajan at the beginning of the 2nd century, when Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, wrote to the emperor asking how to deal with the Christians, Trajan replied that they should not be hunted down, but if they were accused and refused to offer sacrifice to the gods, they should be executed. Under Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, in the second half of the 2nd century, the persecutions intensified. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, described that in his city Christians were tortured, thrown to wild beasts, and some renounced their faith under torture. Saint Blandina was tortured to death, but did not recant, inspiring other martyrs with her steadfastness. Under Emperor Decius in the middle of the 3rd century, the persecutions became systematic for the first time. Decius issued an edict requiring all inhabitants of the empire to offer sacrifice to the gods and receive a certificate, a libellus, confirming this. Christians who refused were arrested. Thousands were executed, thousands recanted. Pope Fabian of Rome was seized and died in prison. These persecutions created the problem of the lapsi, the fallen. What to do with Christians who had renounced their faith under threat of death, but later repented and wanted to return to the church? Some bishops, like Novatian, were adamant. Apostates cannot be forgiven. They betrayed Christ. Others, like Cornelius, Bishop of Rome, were merciful. The church can forgive the penitent. The dispute led to a schism. Novatian declared himself Antipop, the first in history, creating an alternative church, but the majority of communities supported Cornelius. The principle was established. The church can forgive even grave sins if a person sincerely repents. The most brutal persecutions occurred under Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th century. Diocletian, a great reformer, tried to restore the old Roman religion. seeing it as the basis for the unity of the empire. In 303, he issued a series of edicts against the Christians. Churches were destroyed, sacred books were burned, and clerics were arrested. Then the edict spread to all Christians. They had to offer sacrifice to the gods or die. Thousands were executed throughout the empire. In Egypt, according to Eusebius, a church historian, so many Christians were executed that the executioners grew weary and the swords grew blunt. In North Africa, many fled to the desert, becoming the first hermits, the anchorites. At the time, Bishop Marcellinus allegedly recanted, though later sources justified him. But the Christian community by this time was already too large, too widespread to be destroyed. Christianity had penetrated all layers of society. There were Christian slaves and Christian aristocrats, Christian soldiers and Christian philosophers. Christian communities existed in every province of the empire, from Britain to Mesopotamia, from Germany to North Africa. And all this time, Peter's grave on the Vatican Hill remained a sacred place. Christians came here secretly, at night, prayed, and left gifts. Over the grave, a small edicula was built, a monument mentioned by the presbyter Gaius around the year 200. Gaius wrote that he could show the trophies of the apostles if one went to the Vatican, or to the road to Ostia, where the graves of Peter and Paul were located. This edicula was a simple construction, two small columns supporting a stone slab. Beneath it was a niche where the bones of Peter rested, wrapped in purple cloth. The walls around it were covered with graffiti from pilgrims' prayers, names, appeals to the saint. Saint Peter, pray for us. Peter, remember your servant. Christ and Peter. Archaeologists excavating under street Peter's Basilica in the 20th century found these graffiti, preserved under layers of subsequent structures. They found the edicula, the red wall built in the 2nd century to protect the grave. They found the bones which Pope Paul VI in 1968 declared to be the bones of St. Peter. The place of the apostles' execution and burial became the heart of the Christian world. Even before Christianity became legal, the bishops of Rome, successors to Peter, received special authority precisely because they led the community. Founded by the first of the apostles, the community guarding his grave. Other cities had their apostolic foundations: Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. But Rome was special. Here both Peter and Paul died. Here was the capital of the empire, and here would be the heart. But everything was to change in 312, when one man saw a sign in the sky and changed the fate of Christianity forever. Constantine and the triumph of the Church. 312 AD. The Roman Empire is torn apart by civil war. After the abdication of Diocletian and his co-ruler Maximian in 305, the system of the Tetrarchy rule by 4 emperors collapsed. Now 6 contenders are fighting for power. Each commands armies, controls provinces, and mints coins with their own image. In the western part of the empire, there are 2 main rivals. Maxentius, the son of the former Emperor Maximian, controls Italy and Africa. He rules from Rome. Constantine, the son of Constantius Chlorus, controls Britain, Gaul, and Spain. He rules from Trier. Both are young, ambitious, and hungry for soul power. Constantine is 32 years old, tall, strong, fair-haired, a typical northerner. He grew up at the court of Diocletian as a hostage, a guarantee of his father's loyalty. He received an excellent education, studying Greek philosophy, Roman history, and military affairs. He served in the army, fought on the Danube against the Sarmatians, and in Mesopotamia against the Persians. When his father died in Britain in 306 AD, the army proclaimed Constantine emperor. Over the next 6 years, Constantine consolidated his power in the north, repelled Germanic raids, and suppressed rebellions. Now he is ready to move south, to Rome, against Maxentius. His advisors warn him that it is risky. Maxentius controls Italy, has a large army, and is protected by the walls of Rome. But Constantine is confident. He gathers an army of about 40,000 soldiers. veterans of the Gallic and Germanic legions. And in the spring of 312 AD, he crosses the Alps. The path to the south is triumphant. Cities open their gates without resistance. Maxentius's army, sent to stop Constantine, is defeated in several battles. By autumn, Constantine stands at the walls of Rome. Maxentius took refuge in the city, hoping to wait out the siege. He has more soldiers, more supplies. Time, it would seem, is on his side. But Maxentius makes a fatal mistake. His advisors, possibly bribed by Constantine, convince him to leave the city and give battle. On October 28, 312 AD, Maxentius leads his army out of Rome and draws it up at the Milvian Bridge across the Tiber, 3 kilometers north of the city. The night before the battle, Constantine sees an omen. According to one version, recorded by Lactantius, a Christian writer, he sees a dream. Christ appears to him and commands him to mark the shields of his soldiers with the heavenly sign of God, the monogram of Christ, the 2 Greek letters Chi and Rho superimposed on each other. According to another version, recorded by Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea and biographer of Constantine, he sees the omen during the day. In the sky above the sun, a cross of light appears, and the words in Greek, en tuto nikin, this sign, conquer. The following night, Christ appears to him in a dream and confirms the vision. Constantine was a pagan. Although his father sympathized with Christianity, his mother Helena was possibly a Christian, though she was baptized only in her old age. But Constantine was also superstitious, believing in signs, omens, portents, and dreams. If the gods or the God of the Christians promise him victory, he will not refuse their help. He orders the soldiers to place the Christian monogram on their shields. The soldiers obey, although most of them are pagans. For them, it is just another magical symbol, no stranger than the image of Mars or Jupiter they usually carry. On the morning of October 28th, the armies draw up for battle. Maxentius's army is larger, perhaps 70,000 against Constantine's 40,000, but Maxentius has a problem. To return to Rome, in case of defeat, his army must cross the Tiber via the narrow Milvian Bridge. His engineers built an additional pontoon bridge from boats, but it is unreliable. The battle begins at dawn. Constantine's cavalry attacks the flanks of Maxentius's army and overthrows them. The center of Maxentius's army holds, but the flanks collapse. Panic spreads. Maxentius's soldiers begin to retreat toward the bridge. A crush begins. Thousands of soldiers try to squeeze through the narrow bridge. Simultaneously, the pontoon bridge breaks under the weight. People fall into the Tiber in full armor. The heavy armor pulls them to the bottom. The water is red with blood. Bodies float downstream. Maxentius is among those fleeing. His horse carries him toward the bridge, but in the crush, he is thrown into the water. The heavy imperial armor pulls him down. He drowns in the Tiber like Pharaoh in the Red Sea, as Christian preachers would later say, comparing Constantine to Moses. The next day, Maxentius's body is fished out of the river. The head is cut off and displayed on a spear. Constantine enters Rome as a victor, the sole ruler of the western part of the empire. A triumphal arch is erected in the Forum, which stands to this day. Scenes of the battle are depicted on it, but interestingly, there are no traditional images of pagan gods. The inscription states that Constantine won by the inspiration of the divinity. Instinctu divinitatis, a double-edged phrase that could mean either the Christian god or a pagan deity. Constantine attributes the victory to the Christian god. This is a pragmatic decision. Christians constitute a significant minority of the empire's population, perhaps 10%. They are influential, educated, and loyal to one another. Gaining their support is sound policy. But was the conversion sincere? Debates continue to this day. In 313 AD, Constantine meets with Licinius, the emperor of the East, in Milan. They form an alliance. Licinius marries Constantine's sister. They issue the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the empire. The edict proclaims religious tolerance. Everyone may worship the gods of their choice. Confiscated property is returned to Christians. Prisoners are released, and persecutions cease. This is a revolution. For 3 centuries, Christians were outlaws, persecuted, and killed. Now they are free. Churches can be built openly. Sacred books can be read publicly. Worship services can be performed without fear. Bishops receive official recognition, are exempted from taxes, and can judge disputes between Christians. Constantine goes further. He begins to actively patronize the church. He returns confiscated lands and grants new ones. He builds churches large, luxurious ones decorated with marble and gold. In Rome, he builds the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the first official cathedral where church councils would be held. He gifts the Bishop of Rome, Mitiodus, the Lateran Palace, formerly the palace of his wife Fausta, as a residence. The bishops of Rome will live here for the next 1,000 years before moving to the Vatican. But Constantine's greatest project is the construction of a basilica over Peter's grave on the Vatican Hill. This will be not just a church, but a monumental structure, a symbol of the triumph of Christianity, a monument to the apostle on whom Christ founded his church. There is a huge problem. The entire Vatican Hill is occupied by an extensive necropolis. Hundreds of tombs, from simple graves to luxurious mausoleums, cover the slope. Many tombs are still in use. Families come to perform rituals and leave gifts for the dead. To disturb them is sacrilege by Roman standards, where honoring ancestors is a sacred duty. But Constantine is adamant. Peter's grave must be in the center of the new basilica, under the high altar. Everything else is irrelevant. He orders work to begin. Around 326 AD, an army of workers sets to work. They begin by clearing the territory. Tombs are opened one after another. Families protest, but it is useless. The emperor has ordered it, and his will is law. The tops of the tombstones are cut off. The interiors of the tombs are filled with earth, rubble, and broken bricks. An artificial platform several meters high is created, leveling the slope of the hill. An entire city of the dead is buried alive, if one can say that about the dead. Frescoes on the walls of the tombs, depicting scenes from the lives of the deceased, their feasts, their professions, their favorite activities are hidden underground. Mosaic floors, marble sarcophagi, urns with ashes, everything is buried. The tombs of pagans with images of the Roman gods Bacchus, Proserpina, Diana. The tombs of early Christians with symbols of the fish, Bianca, the Good Shepherd. All are equal in their burial. Only one tomb is spared. Peter's burial place, marked by the edicula and the red wall built in the 2nd century. Around it, a protective structure is built, a massive box of marble, isolating it from the backfill. This structure will become the center of the new basilica. The construction of the basilica takes about 10 years. It is a huge structure, 120 meters long, 65 meters wide, and about 30 meters high. 5 naves separated by 4 rows of columns, with 22 columns in each row. A total of 88 columns. The columns are taken from decaying pagan temples. Marble, granite, porphyry, precious materials symbolizing the victory of Christianity over paganism. The central nave leads to the transept, a transverse nave creating the shape of a cross. In the center of the cross, under a triumphal arch, is the altar, and beneath the altar, deep in the ground, is Peter's grave, now enclosed in a luxurious sarcophagus of marble and porphyry, surrounded by gold, silver, and precious stones. The emperor donates immense wealth. The list of gifts has survived. 7 golden altars, a golden cross weighing 50 kilograms decorated with emeralds, hyacinths, and pearls, a golden crown hanging over the altar with 50 lamps, 150 gold, and silver candelabra, a golden chalice encrusted with agates, 45 silver cups, 20 golden patens, for communion, in addition to lands and estates yielding income for the maintenance of the basilica. Estates in Italy, Gaul, Africa, Syria, and Egypt providing grain, wine, oil, and money. The basilica becomes one of the wealthiest institutions in the empire. In the floor of the central nave, a special window is made the Fenestella Confessionis through which pilgrims can look down into the crypt where the apostle rests. They cannot approach the grave itself, it is too sacred, but they can see it, pray, and lower pieces of cloth on strings so the fabric touches the sacred site and absorbs its holiness. These relics, grandeur, become incredibly valuable. Pilgrims carry them to all ends of the Christian world. Fabric that touched Peter's grave is considered to have miraculous power. It can heal the sick, cast out demons, and protect against evil. Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century would send such relics to kings and bishops as precious gifts. The consecration of the basilica takes place on November 18, 326 AD. Although some historians date this to 319 or 329 AD, it is a solemn ceremony. Constantine is present in person, although he is still not baptized, delaying baptism until his deathbed, as was customary at the time. Pope Sylvester performs the consecration. Numerous bishops from across the empire arrive for the ceremony. Martyrs are glorified, prayers are offered, and hymns are sung. Street. Peter's Basilica will become the center of Christian pilgrimage for the next 1,200 years. Millions of pilgrims will come here to pray at the apostles' grave. Kings will be crowned here, councils will gather here, and popes will rule from here. This is the heart of the Christian world. But Constantine builds not only in Rome. Throughout the empire, he erects churches. In Jerusalem, over the site of Christ's crucifixion, he builds the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. His mother Helena, who became a fervent Christian in her old age, sets off for the Holy Land to search for relics. According to legend, she finds the true cross on which Jesus was crucified, buried under a temple of Venus built by Emperor Hadrian. The cross is divided into pieces and sent throughout the Christian world as sacred relics. In Bethlehem, over the Grotto of the Nativity, Helena builds the Basilica of the Nativity. In Constantinople, the new capital that Constantine founds in 330 AD on the site of ancient Byzantium, he builds the Church of the Holy Apostles, where he himself will be buried in the center, surrounded by 12 cenotaphs of the apostles, symbolically declaring himself the 13th apostle. Constantine also actively intervenes in church affairs. When the Arian controversy flares up over the nature of Christ, whether he was of the same substance, homoousios, as the Father, or merely of a similar substance, homoousios, Constantine convenes the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea in 325 AD. 318 bishops from across the empire gather, argue, and vote. Constantine presides in person, even though he is still not a Christian. Officially, the council condemns Arianism and adopts the Nicene Creed, affirming the consubstantiality of Christ and the Father. This sets a precedent. The emperor has the right to convene councils, preside over them, and approve their decisions. Church and state become intertwined. Bishops become state officials, exempted from taxes and possessing legal authority. In return, they support the emperor, preach obedience to the authorities, and pray for the victories of the imperial armies. Constantine is baptized only on his deathbed in 337 AD, after 25 years of patronizing the church. Why did he delay? For a practical reason. Baptism washes away all sins, but sins committed after baptism require repentance and penance. An emperor whose work includes waging wars, sentencing criminals to death, and political intrigue sins constantly. It is better to be baptized before death, so as to die in a state of grace with all sins forgiven. He is baptized by the Arian bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, which is ironic considering Constantine presided over the council that condemned Arianism. But toward the end of his life, Constantine leaned toward reconciliation with the Arians, perhaps because his son Constantius was an Arian. Constantine dies on May 22, 337 AD. At the age of about 57, his body is transported to Constantinople and buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles. As he had planned, the Senate deifies him, just as they deified previous emperors, which is strange for a Christian. The Church proclaims him equal to the apostles, a saint. Though his personal faith remains a subject of debate, Constantine's legacy is immense. He transformed Christianity from a persecuted sect into a state religion. Although paganism remained legal for another half-century, he built great basilicas, including the First Street, Peter's Cathedral. He convened the First Ecumenical Council, setting precedents for imperial control over the Church. He made bishops influential figures and partners of the state. But his conversion also had dark sides. The Church, once a community of equals, becomes hierarchical, bureaucratic, and wealthy. Bishops, once pastors, become princes. Faith, once a matter of personal choice, becomes a matter of state policy. Heresies, once subjects of discussion, become crimes punishable by exile and death. Constantine also established a dangerous precedent of state intervention in church affairs. For the next 1,000 years, emperors will appoint bishops, convene councils, and resolve theological disputes by force of arms. The Church will fight for independence, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The struggle between popes and emperors will become one of the main themes of medieval history. In 337, all of this is in the future. Now Christianity triumphs, the persecutions are over, and churches are growing. The Basilica on the Vatican Hill stands as a monument to the victory of faith. The blood of Peter, shed nearly 3 centuries ago, has brought incredible fruit, the birth of papal power. Over the next 2 centuries, the Church grows in strength and influence. Emperors patronize it, build churches, grant lands, and issue laws in its favor. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. Emperor Theodosius the Great issues an edict in 380 AD declaring Christianity the only legal religion. Pagan temples are closed, sacrifices are prohibited, and heretics are persecuted. This is a total victory. Less than a century after Constantine, Christianity has gone from a persecuted sect to a state church intolerant of competitors. Pagans, once the persecutors, become the persecuted. Their temples are destroyed or converted into churches. Their festivals are banned. Their philosophers are expelled. In 385 AD, a fanatical Christian mob in Alexandria tore the philosopher Hypatia to pieces, accusing her of witchcraft. Bishops become powerful figures in cities. They control vast wealth, lands, and gold granted by emperors and wealthy donors. They command armies of clerics, monks, and devoted laity. They have legal authority to judge cases between Christians. They become patrons of the arts, commissioning luxurious mosaics, frescoes, and sculptures to decorate churches. The bishops of Rome occupy a special place among bishops. They lead the Church in the capital of the empire, a city with the greatest traditions. They guard the graves of Peter and Paul, the greatest apostles. They preside in the basilica built by Constantine himself. They receive gifts from emperors, pilgrims, and believers from all over the world. But most importantly, the bishops of Rome begin to assert a special authority over the entire Church. They call themselves the successors of Peter, to whom Christ gave the keys to the kingdom of heaven. They claim that their decisions on matters of faith are final and that other bishops must obey them. This causes resistance. Bishops of other great cities, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, do not want to recognize the supremacy of Rome. They assert that all bishops are equal, that decisions should be made by councils and not by one man. A struggle begins that will last centuries and, in the end, lead to the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. Bishop Leo I of Rome, who ruled from 440 to 461 AD, played a key role in establishing papal authority. Leo was a brilliant theologian, administrator, and diplomat. He wrote the Tome, a theological treatise on the 2 natures of Christ, divine and human, which was adopted by the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD as orthodox doctrine. But Leo was also a politician. He actively asserted the primacy of the Roman See. He wrote that the Bishop of Rome is the heir of Peter. having received from him the power to bind and to loose. Other bishops received power through him, as participants in his care, but not in the fullness of power. This was a revolutionary doctrine, asserting a papal monarchy over the Church. Leo also showed courage in the face of barbarian invasions. In 452 AD, Attila, leader of the Huns, the scourge of God, invaded Italy. His hordes sacked Aquileia, Milan, and Pavia, and were moving toward Rome. The emperor was powerless, hiding in Ravenna. The Roman Senate was in a panic. Who could stop Attila? Leo set out to meet Attila personally, the 70-year-old bishop in full regalia, with a procession of clerics, headed to the Hun camp. They met on the Mincio River near Mantua. Exactly what Leo said to Attila is unknown. No records of the negotiations have survived, but the result was striking. Attila turned back and retreated from Italy, leaving Rome untouched. Legend, recorded later, says that Attila saw a vision of the apostles Peter and Paul standing beside Leo with swords, threatening him with death if he did not retreat. More likely, Leo offered a huge tribute in gold, food, and hostages. Perhaps he warned that the Hun army was weakened by hunger and disease, that Rome was difficult to take, and that the emperor was preparing a counterattack. Perhaps all of these together. But in the eyes of contemporaries, it was a miracle. A bishop, unarmed, saved the city where the emperor and the army could not. 3 years later, in 455 AD, the Vandals under King Gaiseric arrived from Africa and besieged Rome. This time Leo could not prevent the plundering. The Vandals took the city and looted it for 14 days. But Leo convinced Gaiseric not to kill the inhabitants and not to burn the buildings. The looting was relatively civilized, if such a word applies to plundering streets. Peter's basilica was not touched, although gold decorations were removed. These events established the authority of the Bishop of Rome as the protector of the city, a role previously played by the emperor. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell in 476 AD, when the last emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by the Germanic commander Odoacer, the Bishop of Rome remained the sole figure of authority and stability in the city. Rome was plundered, but not destroyed. The barbarians who seized Italy, the Ostrogoths under Theodoric, were Christians, albeit Arians. They respected the church, did not touch the basilicas, and even patronized them. Theodoric, who ruled Italy from 493 to 526 AD, lived in Ravenna but frequently visited Rome, restoring aqueducts, baths, and public buildings. The bishops of Rome during this period were primarily mediators between the barbarian kings and the Roman population. They provided food during famines, organized the ransom of captives, and negotiated peace. They became the de facto rulers of Rome. Although formerly Italy was the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, Pope Gregory, who ruled from 590 to 604 AD, completed the transformation of the Bishop of Rome into a secular ruler. Gregory was an aristocrat and prefect of Rome before becoming a monk. Elected pope against his will, he proved to be a brilliant administrator. Gregory reorganized the management of the vast papal estates, the patrimonies, scattered throughout Italy, Sicily, Gaul, Africa, and Illyria. These estates produced grain, wine, and oil, and brought in enormous revenues. Gregory appointed managers, rectors, who controlled production, revenue collection, and the shipment of products to Rome. He used these revenues to support clerics, help the poor, ransom captives, and repair churches. When the Lombards, a new Germanic tribe, invaded Italy and besieged Rome, Gregory personally negotiated, organized the defense, and provided food. He effectively performed the functions of a secular ruler. Even though formerly Italy was under the rule of the Byzantine Empire, whose exarch sat in Ravenna, Gregory was also a great reformer of worship. He reorganized the liturgy and introduced Gregorian chant, plainsong, which would be used in the Western Church for the next 1,000 years. He wrote the Pastoral Rule, a guide for bishops, dialogues on the lives of Italian saints, and many letters preserved in his extensive correspondence. Gregory was also a missionary, he sent the monk Augustine to Britain to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Augustine landed in Kent in 597 AD, converted King Thelberth, and founded the archbishopric in Canterbury. This was the beginning of the conversion of England, which would take the next 100 years. Gregory was the last of the four great Latin fathers of the Church, along with Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine. After him, Latin patristics ended. The early Middle Ages began. Gregory was a bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages, the last Roman and the first medieval pope. After Gregory's death, the papacy entered a difficult period. Italy was torn between the Lombards, who controlled most of the peninsula, and Byzantium, which controlled Ravenna, Rome, and the south. The popes found themselves between two fires, forced to maneuver, sometimes supporting the Lombards against Byzantium, and sometimes vice versa. Byzantine emperors tried to control the church and impose theological decisions pleasing to the East. When Emperor Constantine in the 7th century imposed iconoclasm, the banning of icons, the popes resisted. This led to a break. The popes sought new protectors and found them in the Franks, the most powerful Germanic kingdom. Thus begins the next chapter of history, the donation of Pepin and the birth of the Papal States. The Papal State and the Dark Age, middle of the 8th century. Italy is in a state of chaos. The Byzantine Empire, the nominal ruler of Rome, is weakening. Its exarch in Ravenna controls only a narrow strip of territory. The Lombards, a Germanic tribe that seized most of Italy in the 6th century, are growing stronger. Their king, Aistulf, is ambitious and aggressive. He captures Ravenna in 751, expelling the Byzantine exarch. Now he turns his sights toward Rome. Pope Stephen is in despair. Byzantium cannot protect him. It is struggling for its own survival against the Arabs in the east. The Lombards threaten a siege. If Rome falls, the papacy will fall under the control of Arian barbarians. The church will lose its independence. A new protector is needed, strong, Catholic, and far enough from Italy so as not to threaten papal authority. Stephen turns to Pepin the Short, king of the Franks. The Franks are the most powerful Germanic kingdom, controlling most of Gaul and Germany. They are Catholics, unlike the Arian Lombards. They are militarily strong. But why should Pepin help? What can the Pope offer him? Pepin has his own problem with legitimacy. His father, Charles Martel, was the mayor of the palace, the chief administrator under the kings of the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingians had ruled the Franks for 300 years, but by the 8th century, they had degenerated into weak, spineless kings, the do-nothing kings, as they were called. Real power lay with the mayors of the palace. In 751, Pepin carried out a coup. He deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric I, cut his hair, the sign of royal dignity among the Franks, and imprisoned him in a monastery. Pepin proclaimed himself king, but many Frankish aristocrats considered him a usurper. The Merovingians had ruled for 300 years. Their power was sanctified by tradition. Who was this Pepin to overthrow them? Pepin needed legitimation, and only one person could give it: the Pope, the vicar of Christ on earth, whose blessing transforms a usurper into a legitimate king. A year ago, Pepin sent a delegation to Rome with the question, who should be king, the one who carries the title, or the one who holds the power? Pope Zachary replied that it is better to call the one who holds the power king. This was the blessing of the coup. Now Stephen, Zachary's successor, travels personally to Francia to ask for help. It is an incredibly dangerous journey. January 754. Midwinter. Stephen must cross the Alps, snow-capped mountains where travelers often perish from the cold, avalanches, or bandits. But there is no choice. Rome is in danger. The journey takes weeks. Stephen, with a small retinue of clerics, ascends dangerous mountain trails, snow up to the waist, the wind cutting his face. Fingers go numb from the cold. Mules plummet into abysses, but they continue. Finally, they descend into the valleys of Burgundy and arrive at Pepin's court at Pantheon on Christmas 753. The meeting is historic. Pepin comes out to meet the Pope, walking on foot beside his horse and holding the reins, demonstrating submission. This is a symbolic act. The king submits to the Pope, recognizing his spiritual superiority. Then Pepin prostrates himself before Stephen, asking for a blessing. Negotiations last several days. Stephen implores Pepin to protect the church from the Lombards. Pepin bargains. What will he get in return? Stephen proposes a deal. He will personally crown Pepin and anoint him with holy oil, as the kings of Israel were anointed. He will proclaim Pepin king by the will of God. Furthermore, he will anoint Pepin's two sons, Charles and Carloman, as heirs to the throne, guaranteeing dynastic succession. In return, Pepin will protect the papacy from the Lombards and gift the Pope the territories taken from the enemies. The deal is struck. On July 28, 754, in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the main abbey of the Franks, Pope Stephen performs the coronation ceremony. Pepin kneels. Stephen anoints his head with holy oil, myrrh mixed with balsam. He places a crown on Pepin's head. He proclaims him king of the Franks by the grace of God. He anoints the two boys, Charles and Carloman. He declares that no one from any other line may be king of the Franks under pain of excommunication. This is a revolutionary act. Until now, the kings of the Franks were elected by the aristocracy. Their power was based on military strength and the nobility of their lineage. Now, the king receives power from God through the Pope. This sets a precedent for centuries. The kings of Europe will be crowned by the Church. Their power is sanctified by divine right. Pepin fulfills his part of the deal. In 754, he leads an army into Italy. He besieges Aistulf in his capital, Pavia. The Lombards cannot withstand the battle-hardened Frankish army. Aistulf capitulates, promises to return the seized territories, and pays tribute. But as soon as Pepin leaves, Aistulf breaks the promise. He attacks Rome again. Stephen writes desperate letters to Pepin. One letter is written in the name of Saint Peter himself, as if the apostle is personally appealing to the king of the Franks. O my sons, Franks, I implore you for the sake of the living God, do not allow the city of Rome, where my body rests, to be destroyed by the pagans. Pepin responds. In 756, he again leads an army into Italy and again besieges Pavia. This time he is unrelenting, and Aistulf capitulates for good. Pepin takes the Exarchate of Ravenna and a large territory in central Italy from the Lombards. But instead of returning these lands to Byzantium, the rightful owner, Pepin gifts them to the Pope. This is the donation of Pepin, the foundation of the Papal States. In 756, a secular state ruled by the Pope is born. The Pope is now not only a spiritual leader, but also a secular monarch, ruling territory, collecting taxes, and commanding an army that wages wars. This status will last for centuries until 1870. But there is a problem with legitimacy. What right does the Pope have to these lands? Pepin gave them, but he himself took them by force from the Lombards, who took them from Byzantium. This is a fragile foundation. Something ancient and indisputable is needed. Something that makes papal authority over these territories legitimate from time immemorial. And then, possibly in the 8th century, though the exact date is unknown, a document is created in the papal chancery that will go down in history as one of the most successful forgeries of all time. The donation of Constantine. This is allegedly a decree by Emperor Constantine the Great, written in the 4th century, shortly after his conversion to Christianity. The document tells a story. Constantine was struck by leprosy, a terrible disease covering the body with sores. Pagan priests advised him to bathe in the blood of innocent children to be healed. Constantine ordered the children to be gathered. But when he saw the weeping mothers, his heart softened. He refused to kill the innocent. That night, the apostles Peter and Paul appeared to him. They said that Pope Sylvester, the bishop, would heal him. Constantine summoned Sylvester. The Pope baptized him, and the leprosy miraculously disappeared. In gratitude for the healing, Constantine issued a decree. He gifts the Pope the Lateran Palace as a residence. He gifts the Pope the signs of imperial authority: the diadem, the Phrygian cap, the purple cloak, and the scepter. He gifts the Pope authority over all the churches of the world. He gifts the Pope supremacy over the 5 patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Most importantly, he gifts the Pope power over Rome, Italy, and all the western provinces of the empire. Furthermore, Constantine declares that he is leaving Rome, moving the capital to the east to Constantinople, because it is unfitting for an earthly emperor to rule where God has established the head of religion. The Pope will rule in the west, the emperor in the east. This was an incredible document. If it had been authentic, it gave the Pope the legal right to secular power, granted by the first Christian emperor himself. It justified the existence of the papal states as legitimate, ancient, and established by divine providence through the emperor. The donation of Constantine was used for centuries by popes to justify their claims. It was cited in disputes with the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. It was used to repel Byzantine claims to Italy. It was presented to kings and princes, demanding recognition of papal authority. Only in the 15th century, nearly 700 years later, did the humanist Lorenzo Valla prove it was a forgery. Valla, serving the King of Naples, who was in conflict with the Pope, analyzed the text. He discovered anachronisms. The Latin of the document was not the classical Latin of the 4th century, but the medieval Latin of the 8th century. The document mentioned terms and institutions that did not exist in Constantine's time. The story itself was absurd. Constantine did not suffer from leprosy. He was baptized on his deathbed, not by Sylvester. He did not gift the western provinces to the Pope. Valla published his analysis in 1440, under the title Discourse on the Forgery of the Alleged Donation of Constantine. It was a fatal blow to the document. The Church tried to suppress Valla's work, but it was too late. The invention of the printing press allowed for wide distribution. By the 16th century, educated Europe knew the donation of Constantine was a forgery. But in the 8th century, no one doubted it. The document was accepted as genuine, giving the popes a legal basis for secular power. The papal states existed and were recognized by Frankish kings, Byzantine emperors, and local aristocrats. Pepin's son Charles, later called the Great, continued the alliance with the papacy. Charles became king of the Franks in 768 after the death of his father and brother. He was a warrior conqueror who expanded the Frankish kingdom into a vast empire. He conquered Saxony, converting the pagans by the force of the sword. He conquered Bavaria, Lombardy, and part of Spain. His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. Charles also patronized the church. He built monasteries, schools, and churches. He invited scholars from all over Europe to his court in Aachen, creating the Carolingian Renaissance, a flourish of culture and education. He reformed the liturgy, standardized church texts, and supported missionary work. When the Lombards again threatened Rome in 773, Charles invaded Italy, besieged them in their capital Pavia, and captured their king Desiderius. He proclaimed himself king of the Lombards, annexing their kingdom. He confirmed the donation of lands to the Pope, even expanding the papal states. On Christmas 800, an event occurred that changed the history of Europe. Charles was in Rome, celebrating Christmas. During Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, while Charles was praying before the altar, Pope Leo XI suddenly approached him. In the Pope's hands was a golden imperial crown. To the singing of the clergy and the acclamations of the crowd, Leo placed the crown on Charles' head, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. Charles, according to his biographer Einhard, was surprised and displeased. He supposedly said he would not have entered the church if he had known of the Pope's intention. But historians doubt this. The coronation was carefully planned. Charles arrived in Rome a month before Christmas. He knew what was being prepared. His displeasure was perhaps a diplomatic gesture to avoid offending the Byzantine emperor, who considered himself the only legitimate emperor of the Romans. Charles's coronation had enormous consequences. It restored the empire in the West, which had been vacant for 3 centuries, since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. It created the Holy Roman Empire, which would exist for more than 1,000 years, until 1806. It established the principle that it is the Pope who crowns emperors, giving the Church enormous power over secular rulers. Byzantium was indignant. How does a barbarian king dare to call himself Emperor of the Romans? How does the Pope, a subject of the Byzantine Emperor, dare to crown a rival? But Byzantium was too weak to do anything. In 812, it was forced to recognize Charles as emperor, though of the Franks rather than the Romans. Charles died in 814 at the age of 72. His empire was divided among his grandsons by the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which marked the beginning of France, Germany, and Italy. But the idea of a Christian empire in the West, ruled by an emperor crowned by the Pope, survived. The next 2 centuries became the darkest in the history of the papacy. The Carolingian Empire disintegrated. Europe plunged into chaos. Vikings plundered from the north. Arabs plundered from the south. Hungarians plundered from the east. Central authority vanished. Feudal anarchy reigned. The strong robbed the weak. Castles were built on every hill. Roads became dangerous. Cities shrank, and trade ground to a halt. The Dark Ages were truly dark. Rome was no exception. The city fell into decay. The population decreased from 1 million in imperial times to 30,000 by the 10th century. Aqueducts collapsed, and the forums turned into cow pastures. Ancient temples were used as quarries. The Colosseum became the fortress of a local baron. The Pantheon was converted into a church. Triumphal arches were buried under the garbage of centuries. The papacy became a prize in the political game of powerful Roman families. They fought for control over the papal throne because it provided power, wealth, and influence. They used any means: bribery, violence, murder to seat their procs on the throne of St. Peter. In 897, an event occurred that symbolized the depth of the downfall. Pope Stephen VI, a creature of the Spoleto family, one of the powerful Roman dynasties, ordered the exhumation of the corpse of his predecessor Formosus, who had died 9 months earlier. The corpse was dressed in papal vestments, seated on a throne, and tried in what became known as the Cadaver Synod, the most gruesome trial in the history of Christianity. Cardinals, bishops, and Roman nobility gathered in the vast hall of the Basilica of St. John Lateran. On the throne sat the corpse of Formosus stiff, beginning to decompose, emitting the stench of death. Nearby stood a young deacon, appointed as the defender of the dead pope, trembling with fear and disgust before this macabre farce. Pope Stephen personally led the prosecution. He paced before the throne, shouting and gesturing, addressing the corpse as if it were a living person. Why did you, driven by ambition, usurp the apostolic see of Rome when you were already the Bishop of Porto? He demanded of the dead man. Canonical law forbade the transfer of a bishop from one see to another. Formosus had been the Bishop of Porto before becoming Pope. Consequently, his election was illegal. The deacon muttered something indistinct in defense. But what defense is possible for the dead? The trial was a farce. The result was predetermined. The synod found Formosus guilty of several crimes: transfer from one episcopal see to another, illegal appropriation of the papal throne, and the crowning of Arnulf of Carinthia as emperor without the consent of the Roman nobility. The sentence was brutal and humiliating. All of Formosus's acts and ordinations were annulled. All priests ordained by him were stripped of their rank. Their ordinations were declared invalid. They were no longer priests. Their sacraments had no power. The 3 fingers of the corpse's right hand, the fingers with which he blessed, were cut off. The body was stripped of its papal vestments and redressed in the clothes of a commoner. But this was not enough for Stephen's vengefulness. Formosus's corpse was thrown into the street. It was dragged through the streets of Rome to the mockery and curses of the crowd, specially gathered for this shameful spectacle. Then the body was thrown into the Tiber River. The former pope, the vicar of Christ on earth, floated down the dirty river like refuse, like a suicide or a criminal deprived of Christian burial. But the story did not end there. According to legend, Formosus's body washed ashore downstream, where it was found by a hermit monk. Shocked by the sacrilege, the monk buried the body according to the Christian rite in a small cemetery. Another version says that a fisherman caught the corpse in his nets and, recognizing it as the Pope by the remnants of the vestments, took it to a church. Soon, rumors of miracles began to creep through Rome. They said that statues of saints in the church bowed when Formosus's body was carried past. They said that divine light emanated from his tomb at night. They said that the sick praying at his grave were healed. The people began to revere Formosus as a martyr, unjustly condemned, a victim of political intrigue. Pope Stephen, the initiator of the Cadaver Synod, ruled briefly after this blasphemy. A few months later, a popular uprising broke out in Rome. The mob, outraged by the sacrilege, stormed the Lateran Palace. Stephen was seized and thrown into a prison in the Castel Sant'Angelo. The former mausoleum of Emperor Hadrian turned into a fortress. Soon he was found dead in his cell, strangled. The official version was suicide, the unofficial, murder by order of the next pope or lynching by enraged supporters of Formosus. The new pope, Romanus, elected a few days later, immediately overturned the decisions of the Cadaver Synod. He rehabilitated Formosus, restored all his acts, and declared his ordinations valid. He ordered Formosus's remains to be reburied with honors in St. Peter's Cathedral in a tomb befitting a pope. But after 4 months, Romanus died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned by Stephen's supporters taking revenge for the deposition of their patron. The next pope, Theodore, continued the rehabilitation of Formosus, but ruled for only 20 days. The cause of death is unclear, but suspicions of poisoning hung over every unexpected death in those times. Then John X became pope, who finally closed the Formosus case. He convened a synod that annulled the Cadaver Synod, restored all of Formosus's ordinations, declared Stephen a criminal, and forbade future trials of corpses. But John also ruled briefly 3 years, then died. The Cadaver Synod became a symbol of the deepest moral fall of the papacy in an era when politics and personal hatred eclipsed all spirituality. It was a time when popes murdered their predecessors, when Roman families manipulated elections, and when women controlled the Holy See through intrigue and seduction. A time that historians would call the pornocracy, the rule of the harlots, or the saeculum obscurum, the dark age of the papacy. But the true horror was only beginning. At the beginning of the 10th century, power in Rome was seized by the family of Theophylact. The head of the family, a wealthy aristocrat and military leader, effectively controlled the election of popes, using his soldiers to intimidate the cardinals. But the true power belonged to the women of his family, his wife Theodora the Elder and his daughter Marozia, women so powerful and ruthless that their influence defined the fate of the papacy for half a century. Marozia and the pornocracy. Marozia was born around 885 into the family of Theophylact, one of the most influential and wealthy aristocrats in Rome. Her mother, Theodora the Elder, was a woman of legendary beauty and intellect who controlled politics through her husband and lovers. Marozia inherited her mother's beauty and surpassed her in thirst for power and ruthlessness. While still a teenager, Marozia became the mistress of Pope Sergius E, a middle-aged man, ambitious and cruel. Their connection was an open secret in Rome. From this union, as chroniclers claim, a son was born. This son was named John, and he would become Pope John Shi. Imagine a pope born from the illegitimate union of a previous pope and the daughter of a Roman aristocrat. This is the symbol of an era when the papacy turned into dynastic property, passed on like a royal throne. Marozia married for the first time Alberic I, Duke of Spoleto, a powerful feudal lord who controlled much of central Italy. The marriage was a political alliance that combined the wealth of the Theophylact family with the military power of Spoleto. From this marriage, children were born, including a son also named Alberic. Through her husband, Marozia controlled vast territories, but the real power was in Rome, where her family effectively appointed the popes. In 914, Pope John X was elected. He was a capable administrator who organized Rome's defense against Arab raids. The Arabs had seized Sicily and were raiding mainland Italy. John created a coalition of Italian princes, including Alberic, Marozia's husband, and defeated the Arabs at the Battle of Guglielmo in 915. But John made a mistake. He tried to pursue an independent policy without consulting the Theophylact family. Marozia did not tolerate disobedience. In 928, her husband Alberic died in battle against the Hungarians. Marozia quickly married a second time to Guy, Marquis of Tuscany, an even more powerful feudal lord. With a new husband and new strength, Marozia moved against the Pope. In 928, soldiers burst into the Lateran Palace. Pope John X was seized and thrown into prison in the Castel Sant'Angelo. A few months later, he was found dead in his cell. The official version was natural death, but the historian Liutprand of Cremona, a contemporary of the events, wrote that John was strangled with a pillow by order of Marozia. Leo, an old and sick man, was elevated to the papal throne, and he ruled for only 7 months and died. His successor Stephen V ruled for 2 years, then also died under mysterious circumstances. Both were Marozia's puppets, carrying out her will without question. In 931, Marozia's husband Guy died. According to some versions, he was poisoned by Marozia herself, who wished to free herself for a more profitable marriage. She married a third time, now to her half-brother Hugh, King of Italy. This was an incestuous marriage, forbidden by canon law. But who cared? Marozia controlled the Pope, who granted a dispensation, permission for the marriage. In 931, John She ascended the papal throne. He was about 25 years old. Chroniclers openly wrote that he was the illegitimate son of Pope Sergius I and Marozia. Some modern historians dispute this, considering him the son of Marozia's husband Alberic, but medieval sources are unanimous. John was the son of a pope, the grandson of an aristocrat, and the nephew of the King of Italy. This was an incredible concentration of power in one family, but John was weak and spineless, completely under his mother's control. He made no decisions without her consent. Marozia effectively ruled the church through her son. She attended church councils, appointed bishops, and distributed church revenues. Rome whispered that the Senatrix, as Marozia was called, was stronger than the Pope. It seemed Marozia had achieved absolute power. She ruled Rome through her son the Pope. She was married to the King of Italy. She controlled the vast wealth of the Theophylact family. She was perhaps the most powerful woman in Europe at that time. But she had an enemy in her own family. Her son from her first marriage, Alberic I, a young man about 20 years old, ambitious and proud, watched his mother's power with jealousy. When Marozia married Hugh, Alberic saw a threat. Hugh, the King of Italy, was a foreigner, a stranger in Rome. If he established himself here, he would push Alberic away from power. During the wedding feast at the Castel Sant'Angelo, a quarrel occurred. Details differ in the sources. According to one version, Alberic served water for Hugh to wash his hands, as was customary at the table, but did so clumsily or disrespectfully. Hugh struck his stepson, publicly humiliating him before the guests. According to another version, Alberic openly insulted Hugh, calling him an illegitimate king. Hugh grabbed him by the hair and beat him. Insulted and humiliated, Alberic left the feast. At night, he secretly left the castle and headed into the city. He addressed the Roman people, reminding them of Rome's ancient republican traditions. How can the Romans tolerate a foreign king ruling them? How can they allow the Senatrix and her husband to turn the sacred city into their private possession? The Romans, always prone to rebellion, responded. At dawn, a crowd armed with staves, knives, and swords moved toward the Castel Sant'Angelo. They shouted, "Death to the foreigner! Long live the freedom of Rome. Alberic led them, a young, handsome, charismatic leader promising to restore Rome's glory. Hugh, hearing the noise of the approaching crowd, understood the danger. He could not defend himself. The castle was strong, but the garrison was small. If a siege began, it would end in a massacre. He fled shamefully, humiliatingly for a king, descending by a rope from the castle wall. He mounted a horse and galloped north toward his domains in Lombardy. He abandoned his wife, abandoned his allies, thinking only of his own life. The crowd stormed the castle. The gates were broken down. They burst inside, and Marozia was seized. The woman who had ruled Rome for almost 20 years was now a prisoner of her own son. Alberic ordered his mother thrown into a dungeon, into the underground cells of the Castel Sant'Angelo, where she herself had once imprisoned Pope John X. What happened to Marozia after that is not known for certain. Sources diverge. Some say she died in confinement after several years, forgotten, alone. Others claim that Alberic ordered his mother's execution to be strangled or drowned in the Tiber, to eliminate the threat. A third group says she was imprisoned in a monastery, where she lived for many more years, atoning for her sins. Liutprand of Cremona, who disliked Marozia, wrote with satisfaction about her downfall. She who raised and deposed popes, who disposed of the fates of kings, who bathed in luxury and power, now ended her life in a prison or a monastery, deprived of everything. He wrote that this was just retribution for her crimes. Modern historians are more restrained. Marozia was a product of her time, an era when political power was everything and morality was nothing. She played the game of power by the rules of her era and played it brilliantly, until she was defeated by her own son. Alberic became the ruler of Rome, prince and senator of the Romans, a title he gave himself. He ruled for 22 years, from 932 to 954. It was a time of relative stability. Alberic was a capable ruler who restored order, strengthened the city walls, and patronized monasteries. But he also strictly controlled the papacy. His half-brother, Pope John Shi, remained on the throne, but was effectively a prisoner. He made no decisions without Alberic's consent. When John died in 935 or 36, the cause of death remained unclear. Some suspected that Alberic eliminated him, fearing the Pope brother might become a center of opposition. The next popes Leo V, Stephen V, Marinus E, Agapetus E were Alberic's puppets. They were elected at his direction, ruled under his control, and died when he decided. Not one dared to oppose the secular ruler of Rome. Before his death in 954, Alberic performed an act that ensured his family's continued control over the papacy. He gathered the Roman nobility, the clergy, and the people and forced them to swear an oath. When Pope Agapetus died, they would elect Alberic's son, Octavian, as pope. The oath was solemn, given on the relics of saints. To break it meant condemning one's soul to eternal damnation. Agapetus died in 955. The Romans, bound by the oath, elected Octavian as pope. He was 18 or 19 years old, almost a child. He took the name Jonji. For the first time in history, a pope changed his name upon election, establishing a tradition that continues to this day. He did not want to be called Octavian, the name of the Roman Emperor Augustus, considering it inappropriate for a pope. Jonji united secular and spiritual power in his hands, becoming both the Prince of Rome and the Pope. This was an incredible concentration of power in the hands of a youth, and the results were catastrophic. John was the complete opposite of his father. Alberic was stern, disciplined, and pious. John was dissolute, irresponsible, and debauched. He turned the Lateran Palace, the sacred residence of the popes, into a place of orgies, drunkenness, and gambling. Liutprand of Cremona, who visited Rome under John, left a shocking description of his reign. John, he wrote, ordained bishops for money and sold church officers to those who paid the most. He appointed a 10-year-old boy as a bishop because his family was wealthy. He turned the sacred office into a commodity sold in a market. John was obsessed with women. The Lateran palace filled with courtesans, mistresses, and harlots. He seduced the wives of pilgrims who came to pray at St. Peter's Basilica. He corrupted the widow of a wealthy Roman in the basilica itself, upon the grave of the apostle. He had a connection with Stephania, his father Alberic's mistress, his stepmother, which was incest. He drank until losing consciousness, played dice on the altar of the basilica, and invoked pagan gods. During a game at the table, he drank to the health of the devil. He blinded his confessor Benedict, who reproached him for his sins. He castrated Cardinal John, catching him in bed with one of his mistresses. The Romans were shocked but powerless. John controlled the army, the revenues, and the fortifications. Who would dare oppose him? The clergy remained silent, fearing for their lives. The laity murmured but did not act. John also conducted a catastrophic foreign policy. Berengar I, the king of Italy, threatened the Papal States. John, in a panic, appealed for help to Otto I, the king of Germany, the most powerful ruler in Europe at that time. He promised to crown Otto emperor if he protected him from Berengar. Otto responded. In 961, he led an army into Italy, defeated Berengar, and entered Rome. On February 2, 962, in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope John placed the imperial crown on Otto's head. The Holy Roman Empire, which had faded after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, was reborn now under the rule of a Germanic dynasty. But John quickly regretted his decision. Otto did not intend to leave Italy. He intended to restore imperial power, control the Papal States, and subordinate the Pope. He demanded that John swear an oath of fealty and recognize him as suzerain. John refused. As soon as Otto departed from Rome, pursuing Berengar in the north, John began to weave a conspiracy. He secretly contacted Berengar, offering an alliance against the emperor. He appealed to Adalbert, Berengar's son, promising support. He even contacted the Hungarians pagans, proposing they attack Germany. Otto, learning of the betrayal, returned to Rome with an army. John fled the city, taking the papal treasury, gold, silver, jewelry, even stripping the gold ornaments from the altars. He fled to Tivoli, into the mountains east of Rome, where he had allies. Otto entered Rome and convened a synod in St. Peter's Basilica in November 963. The synod accused John of a long list of crimes: sacrilege, simony, incest, adultery, murder, and perjury. Witnesses gave testimony about his debauchery. One cardinal testified that he saw the Pope drinking to the health of the devil. Another, that the Pope seduced his wife. A third, that the Pope played dice on the altar. John was summoned to appear and defend himself. He sent a bold letter. "We have heard that you want to make another Pope. If you do this, in the name of Almighty God, I excommunicate you, and you will have no power to either ordain or serve Mass." The synod ignored the threats. They deposed John, declaring him unworthy of the papal throne. They elected a new pope, Leo V, a layman and the emperor's chief notary. Leo was ordained to all ecclesiastical ranks in a single day and elevated to the papal throne. But John did not give up. In May 964, when Otto departed from Rome, John returned at the head of an armed gang. He stormed the city and restored his power. Leo V fled under the emperor's protection. John convened his own synod, which annulled the deposition and restored him to the throne. Then a bloody revenge began. All who had voted for his deposition faced punishment. Cardinal John, the chief accuser, was seized. They cut off his hand, nose, and tongue. Bishop Otger had his eyes gouged out and his nose cut off. Other clerics were beaten and thrown into prisons. Rome once again plunged into terror. But retribution came not from men, but from God. As pious chroniclers wrote, on May 14, 964, a week after his return, John suddenly died. The circumstances of his death are shrouded in rumors and legends. According to one version, John was in bed with a married woman when her husband caught them. The husband beat the Pope so brutally that John died of his wounds a few days later. According to another version, John suffered an apoplectic stroke right during the sexual act with his mistress. A third version claims that the devil appeared to him and killed him in revenge, because John drank to his health but did not fulfill the promise to sell his soul. A more plausible version is that John was killed by the relatives of the woman, with whom he had a connection. The Roman nobility did not tolerate insults to their honor. To kill a pope was a sin, but to kill a debauchee who had seduced a wife or daughter was a matter of honor. Be that as it may, John G died at the age of 27 or 28. His pontificate lasted 9 years, from 955 to 964, and became a symbol of the moral decay of the papacy during the pornocracy. John's body was buried in St. Peter's Basilica. Despite his crimes, he was the Pope, the anointed of God, and deserved a Christian burial. But the people of Rome did not mourn. Many considered his death a divine punishment, a deliverance from a tyrant and a debauchee. The death of John ended the direct control of the Theophylact family over the papacy. Marozia died in confinement. Her son Alberic died. Her grandson Octavian John G died ingloriously. The dynasty that had ruled Rome for 60 years came to an end. But the pornocracy was not yet over. The following popes would still be puppets of the Roman nobility, German emperors, and local tyrants. The papacy would remain a political office, a prize in the power game for another century and a half, until the reformers of the 11th century began to cleanse the church. The story of Marozia, John G, and the pornocracy shows the darkest side of the papacy. It is a reminder that even a sacred institution can fall when people forget about spirituality and think only of power. It is a lesson that the church would learn painfully and slowly in the following centuries. Reformation and the end of the medieval papacy. After the death of John G, the papacy remained under the control of emperors and Roman nobility for another century. Otto I and his successors appointed and deposed popes at their discretion. Roman families, the Crescenti, the Tusculani, fought for control of the papal throne, sometimes installing 2 or 3 popes simultaneously, each claiming legitimacy. In 1045, an event occurred that finally discredited the papacy. Pope Benedictus, elected at about 20 years of age and the nephew of 2 previous popes, proved to be as depraved as John G. He ruled for several years until the Roman people revolted and expelled him from the city. The Roman nobility elected another pope, Sylvester E. Benedict returned with an army, expelled Sylvester, and restored his power. But after a few months, he decided to marry, which was impossible for a pope. He sold the papal throne to his godfather, John Gratian, for a huge sum, possibly £1,500 of gold. John became Pope Gregory VI. Now there were 3 popes simultaneously. Benedict, who had abdicated but changed his mind and demanded the throne back. Sylvester, who was expelled but considered himself the legitimate pope, and Gregory, who bought the throne but was recognized by many as legitimate. It was chaos, absurdity, a scandal that shocked the Christian world. Emperor Henry E, King of Germany, intervened. In 1046, he convened a synod in Sutri, north of Rome. The synod deposed all 3 popes, Benedict for simony and debauchery, Sylvester for illegal election, and Gregory for buying the throne. Although he was the most worthy of the 3 and sincerely tried to reform the church, Henry appointed a new pope, a German bishop who became Clement E. But Clement died after 9 months, possibly poisoned by Benedict's supporters. The next pope, also a German, ruled for 3 weeks and died. The third pope, Leo X, also a German appointed by the emperor, ruled for 5 years and became a great reformer. Leo X began a church reform aimed at eradicating 2 main vices: simony, the buying of church offices, and Nicolaitanism, the violation of celibacy by priests. He traveled throughout Europe, convened synods, removed unworthy bishops, and appointed reformers. Leo surrounded himself with a group of brilliant reformers, Hildebrand, a monk from Cluny, and the future Pope Gregory V. Humbert of Silva, Candida, theologian, and Polemicist Peter Damian, a hermit and mystic who denounced the vices of the clerics. These men would become the driving force of the Gregorian reform. Named after Gregory V, the reformers sought the independence of the church from secular power. Until now, emperors and kings appointed bishops, controlled church lands, and invested prelates with the ring and staff, symbols of spiritual authority. The reformers considered this an unacceptable interference of the laity in church affairs. In 1059, Pope Nicholas II was elected. He issued a decree that revolutionized the election of popes. From then on, the pope would be elected only by the cardinal bishops, cardinal priests, and cardinal deacons, the high clergy of the church. The emperor could be notified but did not have the right of veto. The Roman nobility and people also had no voice. This was a blow to imperial control and local intrigue. In 1073, Hildebrand was elected pope. He took the name Gregory V. He was small in stature and of a frail build, but of enormous will and energy. He had led the reform movement for 30 years, first as an advisor to popes, now as pope himself. He was adamant in his goals. The church must be free from secular control. The Pope must be the supreme authority in the Christian world, above emperors and kings. Gregory issued a decree against lay investiture. From then on, no emperor, king, or prince could invest a bishop or abbot with the ring and staff. Only the church could appoint its prelates. Violators would be excommunicated. This was a direct challenge to Emperor Henry IV, King of Germany. Henry was young, only 23 years old, but ambitious and powerful. He appointed bishops in Germany and Italy at his discretion, receiving income and military support from them. To give up investiture meant losing control over the church in his kingdom. Henry ignored the decree. He continued to appoint bishops. Gregory warned him. Henry responded with a defiant letter, addressing the Pope not as Pope Gregory, but as Hildebrand the false monk. He accused the Pope of usurping power, of tyranny, and of violating church law. He called upon a church council to depose Gregory. Gregory responded with an unprecedented act. In February 1076, he excommunicated the emperor and released all his subjects from their oath of fealty. This was a fatal blow. The German princes, long dissatisfied with Henry's rule, took advantage of the situation. They announced that they would not obey an excommunicated emperor. They demanded that Henry receive forgiveness from the Pope within a year, or they would elect a new king. Henry found himself in a desperate position. His kingdom was collapsing. The princes had revolted. Cities were closing their gates, and the army was deserting. He needed the Pope's forgiveness at any cost. In the winter of 1076 to 1077, Henry made a journey that would go down in history. He crossed the Alps at the height of winter, the coldest time of year, with a small retinue, snowstorms, avalanches, frostbite. His wife Bertha went on foot. She was carried on a litter through dangerous passes. His infant son Conrad nearly died from the cold. Gregory was at the castle of Canossa in Tuscany, visiting Countess Matilda, his ally, when it was reported that the emperor had arrived and was requesting an audience. Gregory refused to receive him. Henry stood in the castle courtyard in the clothes of a penitent sinner, without imperial regalia, barefoot in the snow. He waited for forgiveness. One day passed. Henry stood trembling from the cold, praying and imploring. Gregory did not come out. A second day, a third day, January 25, 26, and 27, for 3 days, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire stood barefoot in the snow, humbled like the lowliest sinner. Finally, Countess Matilda and other intercessors convinced Gregory to receive the emperor. On January 28, the Pope came out, listened to Henry's confession, gave absolution, and lifted the excommunication. Henry swore to obey the Pope, to mend his ways, and to carry out reforms in the church. Canossa became a symbol of the triumph of papal power over the imperial. The emperor, the most powerful secular ruler of the Christian world, humbled before the Pope. This was the zenith of the medieval papacy. The the moment when spiritual power defeated secular power. But the victory was temporary. As soon as Henry returned to Germany and restored his power, he forgot his oaths. He began appointing bishops again, ignoring papal decrees. Gregory excommunicated him a second time in 1080. Henry responded with a march on Rome. In 1084, Henry's army besieged Rome. Gregory took refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo. Henry proclaimed an antipope, Clement E, who crowned Henry emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. Gregory called upon the Normans from southern Italy for help. The Normans came, but their help proved to be a catastrophe for Rome. They sacked the city, killed thousands, and burned entire districts. The Romans came to hate Gregory for bringing barbarians upon the city. Gregory was forced to flee south with the Normans. He died in exile in Salerno on May 25, 1085. His last words were, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." He was buried in the Cathedral of Salerno, far from the Rome he had tried to liberate. Gregory did not win the specific struggle with Henry, but his ideas won. The investiture controversy continued for another 40 years until it was resolved by the Concordat of Worms in 1122. The Concordat was a compromise. The emperor renounced investiture with the ring and staff, recognizing that spiritual authority comes from the church, but he retained the right to invest bishops with secular authority, lands, and revenues, acknowledging that bishops were also feudal lords. This marked the end of direct imperial control over the church. The papacy won independence, though not complete. The next 2 centuries would be the golden age of papal power, when popes would crown and depose emperors, declare crusades, and control half of Europe. The zenith and decline of papal power. The 12th and 13th centuries were the period of the greatest power for the papacy. Popes of this time were not only spiritual leaders but also political players, controlling the fates of kingdoms, declaring wars, and deposing rulers. Pope Urban I in 1095 proclaimed the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont. He called upon the knights of the Christian world to go and liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. Thousands responded. 4 years later, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, founding Crusader states in the Holy Land. The Crusades became the greatest project of the medieval papacy, over the course of 7 major campaigns and many minor ones spanning 2 centuries. Popes declared the campaigns, granted indulgences to participants, and collected taxes to finance them. The Crusades eventually failed. Jerusalem was lost. The Crusader states were destroyed, but they demonstrated the power of the papacy to mobilize all of Europe for a common goal. Pope Innocent I, who ruled from 1198 to 1216, was perhaps the most powerful pope in history. He considered himself the vicar of Christ, God's deputy on earth, standing above all secular rulers. He wrote, "The Pope is lower than God, but higher than man. He judges all, but is judged by none." Innocent intervened in the affairs of all European kingdoms. He deposed Emperor Otto when he refused to obey. He excommunicated King John of England for refusing to recognize the Pope-appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. England was under interdicta, ban on all church services for 6 years. John capitulated, recognized himself as a vassal of the Pope, and committed to paying tribute. Innocent organized the Fourth Crusade, which ended in catastrophe. Instead of going to Jerusalem, the Crusaders captured and sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and a Christian city. This deepened the schism between the Western and Eastern churches, making reunion almost impossible. Innocent also proclaimed a crusade against the Albigensians, heretics in the south of France. The Albigensian Crusade was a bloody massacre. Thousands of heretics and innocents were killed. Entire cities were burned. When the Crusaders captured the city of Bziers, the papal legate allegedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." 20,000 were slaughtered. After Innocent, papal power remained strong for another half-century. Popes continued to crown emperors, excommunicate kings, and declare crusades. But cracks were appearing. National monarchies were strengthening. The kings of France, England, and Aragon no longer wished to obey the Pope in secular matters. They taxed church lands and appointed bishops, ignoring papal protests. At the end of the 13th century, a conflict occurred that showed papal power was no longer absolute. Pope Boniface V, elected in 1294, was the last pope to assert medieval claims to supreme power. He issued the Bull Unum Sanctam in 1302, asserting that submission to the Roman pontiff is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every person. Two swords, spiritual and secular, both belong to the Church. The secular sword is used for the Church, the spiritual by the Church. One is under the other. The secular subject to the spiritual. This was a direct challenge to King Philip IV the Fair of France. Philip was young, ambitious, and hungry for money for his wars. He taxed the French clergy without the Pope's permission. Boniface forbade this. Philip ignored the ban. The conflict escalated. Boniface threatened excommunication. Philip convened the Estates General, the First Parliament of France, which supported the king against the Pope. Philip accused Boniface of heresy, simony, sorcery, sodomy, and the murder of his predecessor. He demanded a council be gathered to try the Pope. Boniface prepared to excommunicate Philip, but before the bull could be published, a band of armed men sent by Philip attacked the Pope in his palace at Anagni, southeast of Rome. It was September 7, 1303. The leader of the detachment, Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's minister, and Ciara Colonna of the Roman Colonna family, enemies of Boniface, burst into the palace. They found the 85-year-old Pope in full vestments, sitting on his throne, holding a cross. "Strike, here is my head," he allegedly said. They did not kill him, but they beat him, insulted him, and possibly struck him in the face with a metal gauntlet. The residents of Anagni revolted against the invaders and freed the Pope 3 days later. Boniface returned to Rome, broken physically and mentally. A month later, on October 11, 1303, he died. Contemporaries wrote that he died of rage and shame, gnawing his fingers and hitting his head against the wall in madness. The outrage of Anagni symbolized the end of medieval papal power. The Pope was no longer untouchable. A king could send soldiers to arrest and beat the Vicar of Christ. Spiritual authority did not protect against secular violence. Boniface's successor, Benedict XI, ruled for only 8 months and died, possibly poisoned by Philip's agents. The next conclave lasted 11 months. The cardinals split between pro-French and pro-Italian factions. Finally, they elected a compromise candidate, Bertrand de Got, Archbishop of Bordeaux, a Frenchman, but not bound to the king. He became Pope Clement V. Clement was a weak man, sickly and dependent on Philip. He was crowned not in Rome, but in Lyon, in the presence of the King of France. He never went to Rome. He settled in Avignon in the south of France, technically not in the Kingdom of France, but under its influence. This began the Avignon papacy. For 70 years, popes lived in Avignon, from 1309 to 1377. 7 popes, all French, all under the influence of French kings. They built a luxurious palace, more a fortress than a residence, with massive walls, towers, and halls. They surrounded themselves with French cardinals, clerics, and administrators. Rome fell into decay without the popes. The basilicas crumbled. The Lateran Palace burned in a fire in 1308. Factions of the Roman nobility, the Orsini and Colonna, fought in the streets. The population shrank to 20,000, less than during the decline after the fall of the empire. Saint Catherine of Siena, a mystic and visionary, urged the popes to return to Rome. She wrote passionate letters, accusing them of cowardice and calling on them to fulfill their duty to the Church. Finally, Pope Gregory she responded. In 1377, he returned to Rome, but a year later, he died. The conclave gathered in Rome to choose a successor. The Roman crowd surrounded the meeting place, demanding they elect an Italian, a Roman. "We want a Roman pope, or at least an Italian one," they shouted. The cardinals, mostly French, feared for their lives. They elected Urban VI, an Italian, the Archbishop of Bari, but Urban proved to be a harsh, rude, and despotic man. He immediately began to criticize the cardinals for their luxury and corruption, demanding reforms. The French cardinals were outraged. They left Rome, declared the election invalid, claiming it was held under pressure from the crown, and elected their own pope, Clement V, who returned to Avignon. Thus began the Great Western Schism, lasting almost 40 years, from 1378 to 1417. Two popes, each claiming legitimacy, Urban in Rome, Clement in Avignon. Europe split along political lines. France, Scotland, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre supported the Avignon Pope. England, Germany, Scandinavia, most of Italy, and Portugal recognized the Roman Pope. Each pope appointed his own cardinals, excommunicated his rival supporters, and claimed church revenues. When Urban died, the Roman line elected a new pope, Boniface VI. When Clement died, the Avignon line elected Benedict XVI. The schism deepened. By 1409, the situation became unbearable. A group of cardinals from both lines convened a council in Pisa, without the Pope's permission. The council declared both popes deposed as schismatics and heretics. The council elected a third pope, Alexander V, but the other two popes refused to recognize the council's decision. Now there were three popes, simultaneously: Roman, Avignon, and Pisan. The church was divided into three parts. It was an absurdity, a scandal, a crisis threatening the very existence of the church. Alexander V died a year later under suspicious circumstances. Some said he was poisoned by Cardinal Baldassare Corsa, who became the next Pisan Pope, John Sci. John was a man of questionable reputation, a former pirate accused of debauchery, simony, and murder. Pressure to resolve the schism mounted. Emperor Sigismund convinced John to convene an ecumenical council in Constance, Germany. The council opened in 1414 and became one of the largest in the history of the church. Several hundred bishops, thousands of clerics, and representatives of kings, princes, and universities flocked to the small town on Lake Constance. The council acted radically. It declared that the council is above the Pope, that the council receives power directly from Christ, and that everyone, including the Pope, must obey its decisions on matters of faith and reform. This was the conciliar theory, asserting that supreme authority in the church belongs to the council, not the Pope. The council demanded the abdication of all three popes. John XXII, who had presided over the council, tried to flee disguised as a stableman but was caught. He was tried for a long list of crimes: simony, debauchery, murder, and sorcery. He was deposed, convicted, and imprisoned. Gregory G, the Roman Pope, agreed to abdicate voluntarily on the condition that the council be reconvened in his name, maintaining the fiction that only a pope can convene a legitimate council. The council agreed. Gregory abdicated and retired to a monastery, where he soon died. Benedict XVI, the Avignon Pope, a stubborn 90-year-old, refused to abdicate. He declared the council illegal and himself the only true pope. The council deposed him in 1417, declaring him an obstinate schismatic. Benedict fled to Spain, where he ruled in exile with a handful of loyal cardinals until his death in 1423 at the age of 95. On November 11, 1417, the council elected a new, single pope, Martin V, an Italian from the Colonna family. The Great Schism ended after 39 years. The church once again had one recognized pope, but the church was deeply traumatized. The authority of the papacy was undermined. The idea that a council could judge and depose popes sowed the seeds of democracy in the church. Although popes would fight this idea for the next centuries, after the Great Schism, the papacy returned to Rome. But it did not return to spirituality. The 15th century brought the Renaissance, the revival of classical culture, art, and science. Popes became not so much spiritual leaders as secular princes, patrons of the arts, builders, politicians, and sometimes warriors. They restored Rome from ruins. Ancient basilicas were repaired, new churches were built, and palaces were erected. Popes invited the greatest artists of the era to decorate their residences. Fra Angelico painted the Chapel of Nicholas V. Pinturicchio decorated the Borgia apartments. Michelangelo and Raphael would create masterpieces for Julius E and Leo X. But along with the revival of art, corruption returned. The papal court became one of the most luxurious and depraved in Europe. Simony flourished. Church offices were sold openly. Cardinal hats cost thousands of ducats. Bishoprics were auctioned. Indulgences, the remission of sins, were sold like goods in a market. Pope Sixtus V, who ruled from 1471 to 1484, was the first Renaissance pope in the worst sense of the word. He was a Franciscan monk and a theologian, but upon becoming pope, he turned into a secular prince preoccupied with politics, wars, and the enrichment of his relatives. Sixtus practiced nepotism on an incredible scale. He appointed 6 nephews as cardinals, some under the age of 20. He granted them rich benefices, lands, and castles. One nephew, Pietro Riario, received so many positions and incomes that he became one of the wealthiest people in Italy. He lived like a prince, organized lavish banquets, kept mistresses, and spent thousands of ducats on clothes and jewelry. He died at 28 from excesses. Another nephew, Girolamo Riario, became the commander of the papal army. Sixtus helped him seize the cities of Imola and Forli, creating a principality for his nephew. When the Medici rulers of Florence refused to finance these plans, Sixtus supported a conspiracy against them. On April 26, 1478, during Easter Mass at the Florence Cathedral, conspirators attacked the Medici brothers. Giuliano was killed with 29 stab wounds. Lorenzo was wounded, but escaped by hiding in the sacristy. The conspiracy failed. The Florentines caught the conspirators and hanged them from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. The Archbishop of Pisa, involved in the plot, was hanged in his full regalia. Sixtus excommunicated Florence and declared war. For 2 years, papal troops and allies ravaged Tuscany. Peace was only struck when Lorenzo personally went to Naples to King Ferdinand, an ally of the Pope, and convinced him to end the war. Sixtus also built the Sistine Chapel, named in his honor, between 1475 and 1480. The chapel was intended for conclaves and papal ceremonies. Sixtus invited the best artists of Florence and Umbria to paint the walls. Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, and Pinturicchio created frescoes of scenes from the life of Moses and Christ. The ceiling was simply painted blue with gold stars. Michelangelo would paint it later, under Julius E. After Sixtus came Innocent V, a weak and sickly pope, completely controlled by Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, the future Julius E. Innocent openly acknowledged his illegitimate children, married them to wealthy brides, and used papal power for family interests. Under him, the witch hunts in Europe intensified after the publication of a bull against sorcery. Then, in 1492, the conclave elected a man whose name would become synonymous with Renaissance corruption. Rodrigo Borgia, a Spaniard and vice-chancellor of the church for 36 years, became Pope Alexander VI. Borgia was 61 years old but full of energy, ambition, and a thirst for life. Tall, sturdy, and handsome in his youth, now heavy-set but still imposing, he had a loud voice, an infectious laugh, and the ability to charm people. He was also absolutely unscrupulous. Borgia bought the papal throne openly, without shame. The night before the vote, mules loaded with gold and silver were sent to the palaces of the cardinals. Borgia distributed promises to Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, 4 mules of silver, the vice-chancellorship, bishoprics, and abbeys; to Cardinal Orsini, the family palace and lands; to Cardinal Colonna, the Abbey of Subiaco, the wealthiest in Lazio. Even a 90-year-old cardinal from Venice received his share. On the morning of August 12, white smoke rose from the chapel chimney. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. The news shocked Rome. Giovanni de' Medici, a 17-year-old cardinal and son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, wrote to his father, "We are in the maw of a ravenous wolf, and if we do not flee, he will inevitably devour us." Alexander did not hide his nature, even after becoming pope. His mistress, Vanosa de Catane, lived in a luxurious palace and received income from church lands. Their children Cesare I, Joffa, and Lucretia lived in the Vatican, bore titles, and received rich benefices. Cesare Borgia, the eldest son, became a cardinal at 17. Handsome, intelligent, cruel, and ambitious, he hated his church career and dreamed of military glory. When his younger brother Juan, the father's favorite and Duke of Gandia, was murdered in 1497, many suspected Cesare. His body was found in the Tiber with 9 stab wounds. Alexander was heartbroken by the loss of his beloved son. He announced reforms and convened a commission of cardinals to discuss changes in the church. But after a few weeks, the grief passed, and the reforms were forgotten. Alexander returned to his usual life of politics, intrigue, and pleasure. Cesare resigned his cardinalate in 1498, the first cardinal in history to voluntarily renounce his rank. He married a French princess, became the Duke of Valentinois, and received an army from the King of France. With the blessing of his father the Pope, he began the conquest of Romania, territories in central Italy. City after city fell before Cesare's army: Imola, Forli, Rimini, Faenza, Urbino. He was ruthless. When a city resisted, he slaughtered the garrison. Rulers were killed or exiled. In Senigallia, he invited 4 of his former allies to a meeting, seized them, and ordered them strangled that same night. Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat observing Cesare, was simultaneously horrified and fascinated. He would later write The Prince, a treatise on politics and power, using Cesare as a model of the ideal ruler who does what is necessary, without being hindered by morality. Lucretia Borgia, Alexander's daughter, was used as a tool of dynastic politics. She was married off 3 times. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled. When the alliance with the Sforzas became unnecessary, Giovanni claimed the marriage was not consummated, though they had lived together for 4 years. Rumors of incest between Lucretia, her father, and her brother circulated, but these were most likely the slanders of the Borgia's enemies. Her second marriage to Alfonso of Aragon ended in tragedy. Alfonso was wounded in an assassination attempt organized, perhaps, by Cesare. While Alfonso was recovering, he was strangled in his bed. Her third marriage to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, was the most successful. Lucretia became a dignified duchess, patronized the arts, and governed Ferrara when her husband was absent. Under Alexander, debauchery in the Vatican reached incredible heights. The most famous was the feast of October 30, 1501, called the Banquet of the Chestnuts. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies who kept a diary, described the event. 50 courtesans, the best prostitutes in Rome, were brought into the banquet hall. They danced with guests, priests, cardinals, and secular men, first dressed, then gradually undressing, then chestnuts were scattered on the floor. Naked courtesans crawled on all 4s picking up the chestnuts while the men laughed and admired them. After dinner, a competition began. Men copulated with the courtesans right on the floor of the hall, while the spectators watched and cheered. Winners were given prizes: cloaks, shoes, and hats. Alexander, Cesare, and Lucretia watched, judged, and rewarded the winners. Burchard recorded everything dispassionately, like a chronicler, without comment. His diary is shocking. It shows how deeply the Holy See had fallen when the Vicar of Christ organized orgies in his own palace. But Alexander was not only a profligate, he was also a skilled politician and administrator. He expanded papal territories through Cesare's conquests. He reformed church administration and strengthened finances. He issued the bull dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal. Following Columbus's discoveries, he celebrated the Jubilee year of 1500, when hundreds of thousands of pilgrims came to Rome bringing in enormous revenue. The death of Alexander is shrouded in mystery. On August 6, 1503, he dined with Cardinal Adriano di Aceneto at a villa near Rome. A few days later, both Alexander and Cesare fell seriously ill. High fever, vomiting, and delirium. Cesare survived thanks to his youth and strength. Alexander was 72. He died on August 18th after a week of agony. Romans immediately spoke of poisoning. The version recorded by Guicciardini stated that Alexander and Cesare planned to poison the cardinal to seize his wealth. They bribed a cuberer to serve the poison, but by mistake, the cuberer served the poisoned wine to the Borgias. Another version says the cardinal learned of the plot and bribed the cuberer. Modern historians believe it was most likely malaria. August in Rome is the time of marsh fever. Many died of malaria every summer, but the legend of poisoning matched the Borgia reputation. They used poison themselves as a political tool. Why wouldn't they die from it? Alexander's body began to decompose at a terrifying rate in the August heat. His face turned black and swelled. His tongue protruded from his mouth, and his body bloated like a barrel. Contemporaries wrote that it was the ugliest corpse they had ever seen, and that the devil himself had taken Alexander's soul. The funeral was conducted in haste without proper ceremony. The coffin proved too small for the swollen body. Workers had to jump on the coffin to close the lid, breaking the bones of the corpse. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, but without the honors due to a pope. Thus ended the reign of the most profligate pope of the Renaissance. Alexander VI showed just how far a pope could go into vice and still hold onto power. He turned the Holy See into a family enterprise, where the pope's children ruled like princes, where politics were more important than spirituality, and where gold and power eclipsed faith. After Alexander's death, the conclave elected Pius E, old and sick, who died after 26 days. Then Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere was elected the enemy of the Borgias, who became Julius E. He was the complete opposite of Alexander, a warrior, not a profligate. Julius E and the construction of the new cathedral. Julius E, who ruled from 1503 to 1513, was the last warrior pope. He personally led armies into battle, besieged fortresses, and wore armor beneath his papal vestments. He was nicknamed the warrior pope, the terrible pope. Erasmus of Rotterdam sarcastically wrote that Julius conquered more territories with the sword than Christ did with the cross. Julius restored control over the papal states, reclaiming territories seized by local tyrants under his weak predecessors. He expelled Cesare Borgia from Italy. He reconquered Bologna, Perugia, and Rimini. He fought Venice, creating the League of Cambrai of European powers against the Republic. He fought France, driving the French out of Italy. But Julius's greatest legacy was art. He was the greatest patron of the Renaissance, commissioning masterpieces that defined the era. He invited Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo initially refused. He considered himself a sculptor, not a painter. But Julius insisted, threatened, and implored. Michelangelo capitulated. For 4 years, from 1508 to 1512, he worked lying on his back on scaffolding beneath the ceiling. Paint dripped on his face, his neck grew stiff, and his eyes watered. The result was incredible. 520 square meters of frescoes, 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, from the creation of the world to the flood, the creation of Adam, where God's finger touches Adam's, transmitting the spark of life, became one of the most recognizable images in art history. Prophets and sibyls, who foretold the coming of Christ, sit on thrones around the perimeter. 33,000 square feet, 300 figures, a masterpiece that would be studied and copied for 5 centuries. Julius also invited Raphael to decorate the papal apartments. Raphael, the young man of 25, created a series of frescoes in the 4 rooms of the stands, the School of Athens, depicting the greatest philosophers of antiquity: Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. Pythagoras gathered in an ideal temple of reason, the disputation of the Holy Sacrament. showing theologians and saints discussing the mystery of the Eucharist. The Parnassus, where Apollo and the Muses inspire poets. Bramante designed new buildings, courtyards, and loggias in the Vatican. He created the Belvedere courtyard, connecting the Papal Palace with the Villa Belvedere. With terraces, fountains, and gardens, he planned new streets in Rome, cutting straight avenues through medieval labyrinths. But Julius's greatest project was the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. Constantine's old basilica had stood for 1,200 years. It was crumbling, walls were cracking, the roof leaked, and the foundation was settling. Several popes had tried to repair it, but the damage was too great. Nicholas V began planning a new basilica in the mid-15th century, but died before work began. Julius made a radical decision to demolish the old basilica completely and build a new one. The greatest temple of the Christian world, eclipsing everything in existence. It was a bold, almost sacrilegious decision to destroy the church that had stood over Peter's grave for 10 centuries, where emperors were crowned and where ecumenical councils were held. Many protested that destroying the ancient basilica was sacrilege. The old mosaics, frescoes, and the tombs of popes and saints, everything would be destroyed. But Julius was adamant. He wanted greatness, a monument that would glorify his name for centuries. Julius chose Donato Bramante as the architect. Bramante designed a massive cathedral in the shape of a Greek cross, 4 identical arms radiating from the center. Over the center, a giant dome inspired by the Pantheon, but larger, higher, and more majestic. The cathedral was to be 187 meters long and 137 meters wide. The dome, with a diameter of 42 meters, was to be 137 meters high from the floor to the top of the cross. On April 18, 1506, Julius descended into the deep trench dug for the foundation and laid the first stone. The destruction of the old basilica began. Ancient columns were broken, mosaics were knocked down, and altars were dismantled. Contemporaries were shocked. The tombs of popes were opened, and bones were moved. Frescoes that had survived barbarian invasions were destroyed by Roman workers. Erasmus of Rotterdam wrote sarcastically that Julius was destroying Peter's church to build his own monument, and that he looked more like Julius Caesar than Jesus Christ. Luther would later use the destruction of the old basilica as an argument against the papacy, accusing the popes of barbarism and sacrilege. But construction continued. Huge blocks of travertine and marble were brought from quarries. Thousands of workers dug foundations, erected walls, and installed columns. Gold flowed like a river. Julius spent enormous sums, emptying the papal treasury. Money was needed constantly. Julius increased taxes on the papal states. He sold church offices. He began selling indulgences on an unprecedented scale. An indulgence is the remission of temporal punishment for sins, reducing time in purgatory. Theoretically, they were given for good deeds, pilgrimages, and prayers. In practice, they were sold for money. Julius died on February 21, 1513, without seeing the completion of the cathedral. Only the 4 huge pillars supporting the future dome had been erected. Bramante died a year later. The project passed to Raphael, then to Antonio da Songolo the Younger, then to Michelangelo. Construction continued for 120 years through the reigns of 20 popes. Michelangelo, appointed chief architect in 1546 at the age of 71, designed the Great Dome. He worked for 17 years until his death in 1564, but he did not see the dome completed. His students finished the dome by 1590. Carlo Moderno, in the early 17th century, changed the plan from a Greek cross to a Latin cross, adding a long nave because the traditional form of a church required an elongated plan. This decision was criticized because the long nave partially blocked the view of the dome from the square. In the mid-17th century, Gianlorenzo Bernini created the baldacchino over the altar, a giant bronze canopy 29 meters high, supported by 4 twisted columns. The bronze was taken from the roof of the Pantheon, which sparked the famous epigram, What the barbarians didn't do, the Barberini did, referring to the family of Pope Urban V. Bernini also designed St. Peter's Square with two semicircular colonnades, embracing the space in front of the cathedral like the arms of the church, embracing the faithful. The cathedral was consecrated on November 18, 1626, by Pope Urban V, exactly 1,300 years after the consecration of Constantine's Basilica, and 120 years after the laying of the first stone by Julius E. It is the greatest temple of Christianity, covering an area of 23,000 meters, capable of holding 60,000 people. The dome remains the largest brick dome in the world. But the construction of the cathedral had a dark side. The enormous expenses required a constant influx of money. Indulgences were sold aggressively throughout Europe. In Germany, the Dominican monk Johann Tetzel traveled with a mobile shop, selling indulgences with the advertising slogan, "As soon as the coin clinks in the chest, the soul from purgatory jumps out." This outraged many, especially in Germany. Martin Luther, a monk and professor of theology in Wittenberg, was shocked. How could salvation of the soul be bought? How could divine grace be traded, like a commodity on the market, to build a luxurious church in Rome? On October 31, 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, criticizing indulgences and other abuses of the church. It was the hammer with which he nailed the Theses, but it was also the hammer that shattered the unity of Western Christianity. The Protestant Reformation began the greatest schism in the history of the Church, since the separation of the East and West in 1054. Finale. From the Reformation to the present day, Luther's protests spread with the speed of a forest fire. Gutenberg's invention of the printing press 50 years earlier allowed for the mass distribution of ideas. The 95 Theses were translated, printed, and distributed by the thousands. Within 2 weeks, they had spread across Germany, and within a month, across all of Europe. People, long dissatisfied with church corruption, the sale of indulgences, and the luxury of prelates, found in Luther the voice of their protest. German princes, wishing to secularize church lands and stop paying taxes to Rome, supported him. Humanists, wishing for reform, sympathized with him. Simple believers, shocked by the trade in salvation, followed him. Pope Leo X, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, an elegant humanist and lover of art, hunting, and music, initially attached no importance to the rebellious monk. He allegedly said, "It is just a quarrel of monks," hinting at the traditional rivalry between monastic orders. But when Luther refused to recant, the Pope was forced to act. In 1520, Leo issued the bull Exurge Domini Uis, O Lord, excommunicating Luther if he did not recant within 60 days. Luther publicly burned the bull on December 10, 1520, before the gates of Wittenberg along with books of canon law. This was an open break with Rome, an act of rebellion unseen since the Hussite Wars. Emperor Charles V summoned Luther to the imperial diet at Worms in April 1521, demanding a recantation. Luther refused. "Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me," he allegedly said, although historians debate whether he uttered those exact words. He was declared an outlaw and a heretic outcast, but the German princes protected him. The Reformation grew. Half of Germany fell away from Rome. Switzerland, under the leadership of Zwingli in Zurich and Calvin in Geneva, became Protestant. Scandinavia adopted Lutheranism. England separated from Rome when King Henry V quarreled with the Pope over his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Scotland became Presbyterian under the leadership of John Knox. The Netherlands rebelled against Catholic Spain. The Catholic world was collapsing. The Vatican was losing half of Europe, half of its income, and half of its flock. The popes were forced to reform the church to stop the bleeding. Thus began the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, an attempt to cleanse the church from within and reclaim lost territories. Pope Paul I convened the Council of Trent in 1545. The council lasted 18 years with interruptions from 1545 to 1563. becoming the longest in the history of the Church. It reformed church administration, banned the sale of indulgences, tightened requirements for priests, established seminaries for the training of clerics, and codified Catholic theology. The council also hardened the Church's position against Protestants. Protestants were declared heretics. Their books were placed on the index of forbidden books. The Inquisition, reorganized as the Holy Office, received new powers to persecute heresy. In Italy, Spain, and Portugal, Protestantism was almost completely eradicated. Paul I approved the creation of the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits became the elite troops of the Counter-Reformation, educated, disciplined, and fanatically devoted to the Pope. They founded schools and universities, converted Protestants back to Catholicism, and set out as missionaries to Asia, America, and Africa. Europe plunged into religious wars. The 30 Years' War in Germany, the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands, and the religious wars in France. Catholics and Protestants killed each other in the name of Christ. Millions died in the wars from hunger and disease. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War, and established the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion. Each ruler determined the religion of their subjects. Europe split into a Catholic South and a Protestant North forever. The schism became permanent. The Vatican lost political power over half of Europe, but maintained spiritual influence over the Catholic world. The popes were no longer as powerful as in the Middle Ages when they crowned emperors and deposed kings, but they remained the heads of the largest religious organization in the world, governing 200 million Catholics. The following 2 centuries, the Papal States existed as one of the Italian states ruled by popes, but they became increasingly anachronistic. In the era of nation-states, the French Revolution arrived in 1789. Then came Napoleon, who redrew the map of Europe. Napoleon annexed the Papal States in 1809, incorporating them into the French Empire. Pope Pius V excommunicated Napoleon. The enraged emperor ordered the Pope's arrest. Pius was taken as a prisoner to France, where he spent 5 years in confinement in Fontainebleau and Savona. After the fall of Napoleon in 1814, the Congress of Vienna restored the Papal States. Pius returned triumphantly to Rome on May 24, 1814. But the time of the Papal States was running out. The 19th century brought nationalism, the idea that people should have their own states. Italy sought unification. The Risorgimento movement wanted to create a single Italian kingdom. The Papal States were an obstacle, dividing the north and south of Italy. In 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi conquered Sicily and southern Italy. Victor Emmanuel I, King of Sardinia, seized most of the Papal States. Pope Pius VI held only Rome and its surroundings, protected by a French garrison. On September 20, 1870, while France was occupied with the war against Prussia, the Italian army stormed Rome. They breached the walls at the Porta Pia with artillery. The Pope ordered symbolic resistance to show that he was surrendering under duress, and not voluntarily. After 3 hours of fighting, the Papal Guard capitulated. On October 2, a plebiscite showed that the overwhelming majority of Romans wanted to join Italy. Rome became the capital of a united Italy. The Papal States ceased to exist after more than 11 centuries. From 756 to 1870, Pius VI refused to recognize the seizure and declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican. He and his successors did not leave the Vatican and did not recognize the Italian state. Thus began the Roman question, a conflict between the papacy and Italy that lasted almost 60 years. The solution came only on February 11, 1929. Pope Pius VI and the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini signed the Lateran Accords. Italy recognized the sovereignty of the Vatican over a territory of 44 hectares, including St. Peter's Basilica, the Papal Palaces, the Sistine Chapel, museums, and gardens. The Vatican recognized the Italian state and renounced claims to the former Papal States. The state of Vatican City was born the smallest in the world by territory and population, but a state with full sovereignty, with its own laws, currency, post office, flag, guard, radio station, and railway line. The circle was complete, from the fisherman's grave on the Vatican Hill, through 13 centuries of the Papal States to the modern state of the Vatican. The 20th century brought new challenges: World War II, the Cold War, the secularization of Europe, sexual scandals, and financial scandals. But the Vatican survived, adapted, and reformed. The Second Vatican Council of 186,265 modernized the liturgy and opened the Church to the modern world. Today, the Vatican remains the center of the Catholic world, the home of the Pope, and the spiritual leader of 1.3 billion Catholics. Almost 2,000 years have passed from the blood of Peter shed in the year 64 to our days. The history is incredible, bloody, glorious, and shameful, yet continuous. It is a story of how faith, power, and human weakness intertwined in one of the most influential institutions in the world. Thank you for watching, dear viewer. If you like this story, subscribe. There are new tales here. Good night, and until the next journey.